James Bradley's original contribution to speculative philosophy is not well known outside a small circle of friends and former students and colleagues, mostly associated with Memorial University of Newfoundland, where he spent most of his career after graduating from Cambridge in the 70s. He graduated with a dissertation on F.H. Bradley's monistic idealism. F.H. Bradley was no relation of his. But James Bradley did not remain a scholar of British idealism. Indeed, James Bradley was never merely a scholar of anything. He never wrote secondary literature, as most of us spend most of our time doing. Even when he was writing his dissertation, his authorial voice was strong and clear as he tracked the single thought, the one thought, the thought that made him a great philosopher in Heidegger's sense of the term. He didn't always know what that thought was, but he knew he was onto it. He was tracking it until it became clear to him and stood alone in the night sky like a star at the end of his life, which ended somewhat prematurely at the age of 64. That thought was the thought of the Trinity as the keystone of Western tradition, the Western tradition of philosophy and theology. The keystone, that is, the Trinity allows us to think the whole history of the West as one. From the beginning in pre-Socratic philosophy, through the Hebrew Bible and the Christian revelation, through the Middle Ages and Christian Neoplatonism, to modernity and the revolutions associated with modernity, scientific revolution, industrial revolution, political revolution, to postmodernity. For Jim, the West was not simply a bricolage of diverse and heterogeneous things that don't belong together. But it would appear so if we remained ignorant that what holds the whole thing together is the thought of the Trinity. The Trinity as, of course, a revealed doctrine in the Christian church, but far more for Jim as the key to understanding Western rationality and the fundamental answer to the philosophical question posed by the West: why is there something rather than nothing? So Jim's understanding of the Trinity was far closer to Schelling's than it was to, let's say, Karl Barth's or Hans Urs von Balthasar's. The Trinity was a basic theme of theology in the 20th century, and it remains so today. Of course, it's always been that, but it fell into a certain amount of forgetfulness in the modern period, hitting a nadir in the 19th century when the great Protestant theologian Friedrich Schleiermacher famously relegated it to a couple pages at the end of his monumental systematic theology, The Christian Faith. Schleiermacher said the Trinity was not an essentially Christian doctrine. He could not have been more wrong. And it was Karl Barth who launched a new era of Trinitarian speculation in the 20th century by making the Trinity the theme of Christian theology. That the revelation of the Christ consists in the revelation of God as three persons in one being, that is, a Father, Son, Spirit. And each of these three could not be understood as substances. They are inseparable from each other. Their identities are not constituted by substantial, essential difference, but rather by relations. And as Bradley will say often in his essays, this elevation of relationality to an essential determination of being is the fundamental move that launches all the ships, from the political revolutions of early modernity to the scientific revolution to the philosophies of Trinity, which abound in the 20th century, even if they do not know themselves as such. But Jim was not particularly committed to the doctrine of the Trinity as a revelation, which is, of course, Barth's insistence, is that we could not know the Trinity unless it had been revealed in the Christ event. For Jim, far more is it the case that the Trinity has always been known by humanity. And here I would refer to that passage in Schelling's Philosophy of Mythology where he says, "There has never been a time when we have not known the Trinity." Neither Bradley nor Schelling will go so far as to say the Trinity is an innate concept of reason. There are problems with thinking about innate concepts of reason that both Schelling and Bradley are too sensitive to use that language. But nevertheless, there is an a priori to the Trinity, even if that a priori can only be explicitly known when it is elicited by the mythopoetic theology of the New Testament. So for Jim, the fundamental question driving the Western tradition in its modern iteration, in its modern crisis, was the problem of novelty. It would seem that in a universe that was structured according to the substance metaphysics of the ancients, novelty was not possible. As Aristotle said famously, individuum ineffabile est, the individual is ineffable, a phrase that was repeated often by the scholastics. The phrase did not mean that the individual is transcendent or has an excessive intelligibility that is beyond human comprehension. Rather, what Aristotle meant and what the scholastics like Aquinas meant by the phrase is that the individual bears within itself no intrinsic intelligibility such that it could be understood on its own terms. The individual can only be understood as an instance of a universal, as a member of a generic class. And the way to such understanding is by generalizing from all instances to an essence which is in a certain way timeless, unchanging, always already real. As Aristotle says, the essence of a thing is that which a thing always already was. And so in this substance metaphysics, there is no novelty in the sense of an event of something new, which isn't just an instantiation of what has been, but is in fact an unveiling of a new structure, an intelligibility that has never been before, which calls to reason to rise to the occasion of thinking something not in the terms of the categories which it already has established for itself on the basis of previous experience, but in entirely new terms. That is, novelty drives reason into creative thinking, and that is what Jim meant by speculative philosophy. Now, the problem of novelty is everywhere in modernity, from Darwin to quantum physics to the crisis of historicism in the human sciences, to the postmodern fascination of the aporias of difference. It seems that novelty has trumped intelligibility in the modern age. The new disrupts the rational, and for some thinkers demonstrates that being or reality is fundamentally irrational. This was the problem that drove Jim. How to think novelty without sacrificing intelligibility, how to think novelty without sacrificing the principle of reason. That is, nothing is without a reason. Not the principle of sufficient reason. For Jim, the principle of sufficient reason is only appropriate in a deterministic universe where novelty is not possible. The principle of reason, rather, says that nothing is without a reason, even if that something is entirely new and has never before been and demands of thought the construction of new categories to understand it. Jim solved the problem of novelty by appropriating, first of all, the functionalist turn in logic. In this regard, Whitehead is key. The speculative generalization of the function is a move in Whitehead, but it's also found elsewhere, of course, because Whitehead is representative of a whole turn in early 20th century logic, which includes Russell and Frege and Cassirer. But Whitehead is the one, perhaps, who, for Jim, made it most explicit what was happening when one moves to a functionalist model of intelligibility away from a substantialist or essentialist model of intelligibility. And the analogy here is algebra. In an algebraic equation, we can solve an unknown. We can work with an unknown variable, an x whose value is not known, if we understand the function of that variable in an equation. Now that's an extremely formal way of putting the point, but a much more, let's say, an easier way to understand this is what we're doing in algebra and what we're doing in functionalist speculative metaphysics is we are anticipating structure, not on the basis of predicting what will come in a substantial way, but on the basis of understanding the patterns of intelligibility which are emerging in the universe and which the new instance will confirm to some degree, even as it brings us something basically new. Second, Jim solved the problem of novelty by retrieving what he called the speculative tradition of thinking of being as activity. Existence is not instantiation, nor is it substantial monistic reality as in a spinozistic sense, everything else being an attribute or a mode of it. Rather, existence is activity. For Jim, this thinking of existence of activity runs right throughout the Western tradition, even if it's often concealed by other traditions which Jim wasn't interested in fostering, for example, in Aristotelian deductivism. But in Thomas Aquinas, for example, one has a strong notion of existence as activity, as esse, as the act of existence, innermost in everything, ultimately originating in God's infinite act of being, but having this fundamental feature that it cannot be reduced to essence, it cannot be reduced to substance, it cannot be reduced to something with qualities. It is the act of producing qualities, not itself a quality or something with qualities. One finds the notion of existence as activity centrally located in German idealism, particularly in Schelling. And one also finds it in the 20th century in thinkers such as Heidegger, who problematized the question of the meaning of being precisely by showing that being cannot be thought as a thing, but has to be understood as having primarily and originally a verbal sense. Being. It's a gerund. We forget that in English, but it's like swimming or running before it is something. It is an activity that produces something. Third, Jim solved the problem of novelty by, as we said a moment ago, recognizing the Trinity as the keystone of the Western tradition. For Jim, the Trinity is everywhere in the Western tradition, but it was Charles Sanders Peirce who best defined it in his three categories of spontaneity, or firstness, difference or secondness, and order or thirdness. Where there is intelligibility, or I should say, where there is emergent order, that is, novel intelligibility, we will at least find this pattern. A first, something that is preceded by nothing, that is beholden to nothing prior to it, that is evental in that sense. This is, of course, the disruptive moment in novelty. Second, differentiation, that is at least oppositional relationality to other things that already exist. So the first emerges into oppositional relations with others. And third, an ordering of the differentiated beings according to an intelligible pattern. It could be simply the pattern of cause and effect, for example, antecedent and consequent. Now the question emerges, why only 3 principles? Why not 4 or 5 principles? There is only 3 principles because there is nothing further needed to explain being other than a principle of origination, spontaneity, a principle of differentiation, and a principle of unification. One can only count to 3. When one objects that I can count beyond 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, so on, the answer is that, in fact, what you're doing with each new series is you're simply repeating the pattern of the triad. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 do not substantially alter the pattern, the functionalist pattern of intelligibility established by the first 3. They repeat it. One does not need any further numbers because a principle of origination and a principle of differentiation and a principle of ordering the differentiated is sufficient. By the time we get to 3, we've returned to the 1. Essentially what we're describing, and this is very familiar to scholars of German idealism, is an initial unity which is diversified or which is threatened by diversity, fractured, you could say, or challenged by diversity, that is then recapitulated in a third moment that includes that diversity as moments within itself, that orders the diversity. So the third is the 1 recapitulated with the differentiae now ordered as moments of its internally rich dynamic existence. Fourth, Jim solved the problem of novelty by thinking of love as the telos of the universe. Now, Jim here picks up on a theme articulated in Peirce's essay, Evolutionary Love. And of course, there is a New Testament analog to this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was love, we read in the Gospel of John. And Jim was quite conscious of this religious testimony to the point. Nevertheless, Jim wants us to understand love in a much more formal way. And we have to think of love in terms of what was said before. We have to think of love as, first of all, a function rather than a substance. We have to think of love as, secondly, an activity rather than a thing. And we have to think of love as, thirdly, the activity of generating relations. Now, love is a much misused term, but Jim wouldn't hesitate to understand love or to articulate love in terms that are deeply familiar to ordinary loving people. That is, love is the activity of letting be. Love is non-dominating determination. This is an answer to the question why there is novelty, and novelty does not disrupt or disprove the principle of reason. There is novelty because originary being, or the original activity of being, is love. It is non-determining determination. The best way to understand this is by thinking about it in terms of an alternative vision of the universe. Let us say that the originating principle of everything is mind. It is mind that has put everything in the place where it is and where it is best for it to be, as the pre-Socratics said and as Socrates articulated. Now, in such a universe, novelty shouldn't occur. There would be no reason for novelty. And should there be something that appears to be novel, we would simply say that this apparent new emergent structure is in fact an instantiation of the same. Mind, in other words, is a determining determination. It makes things what they are regardless of what they will to be. Love, by contrast, frees the thing to determine itself. It frees the thing to determine itself. For love, the contingency of the other is not a threat. The freedom of the other is not a threat. Think, for example, of the best instantiation of love in human relations. As Jesus puts it, to love another is to lay your life down for the other. Now, that's a rather dramatic way to express this functional point that love lets the other be. Love lets otherness be. And otherness, therefore, is not a threat to love or to the order which is willed by love. Rather, the order willed by love is an order that is freely emergent and self-determining by the beings that are, at any given moment, the players in the drama. For Jim, love as telos is the essential meaning of the Trinitarian revelation. It is the meaning of the Trinity. The Father generates the Son, difference, For the sake of love, ordination, thirdness,